I was alone in the hospital. Have you ever felt completely alone in your life? As if there's no one to hear your voice, no one to see you. And what if that loneliness came from those who loved you most, precisely when you needed them the most? Well, here's a heartbreaking yet inspiring story for you. The tale of a woman who rediscovered her own worth and strength when confronted with the indifference of her closest kin. What you're about to hear will shock you. Are you ready? Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the like button. My name is Margaret Campbell, and I'm 68 years old. I spent most of my life as a nurse. First at Portland City Hospital, then at a quieter clinic in Salem, Oregon. Retirement offered me a peaceful existence. I'd tend to my garden, volunteer at the library, and watch the world go by from my porch. This routine hummed along in a perfect rhythm until that September morning. The sunlight streaming through my kitchen window filled the room with warmth. I prepared a simple breakfast. As I watered the plants on the porch, there was the crisp scent of autumn in the air. I was filled with a strange feeling deep inside that something was going to change today. I decided it was a perfect day to organize the attic. Up there, dusty boxes held years of memories. Harold's high school trophies, Sarah's kindergarten drawings, my nursing diploma. I fetched the ladder from the garage, determined to handle everything myself. Even after Harold passed, and Sarah and my grandchildren moved away, I had learned to be self-sufficient. I climbed the ladder carefully. The bare bulb flickered dimly. I made my way toward a box in a far corner. Old photographs, worn quilts. About an hour had passed when my knees and back began to protest. I decided to bring down one last box. It held Harold's youth photos. Before I could finish balancing the box, I reached my arms for the ladder, beginning my slow descent. Then I don't know exactly what happened. Maybe my foot slipped. Maybe I lost my balance. All I know is that the world tilted at a sharp angle. The attic hatch vanished from view. And then came the unbearable pain that exploded on my left side with a terrible thud. The pain spread like a shockwave. The box fell to the floor beside me. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't think. I could only lie there gasping for breath, my eyes blinking against the sharp light. There was a deep throb in my hip. My years as a nurse screamed that this was no simple sprain. I struggled to reach my phone, which had flown from my pocket during the fall. Finally, I clutched the phone with trembling fingers and dialed 911. My voice was barely a whisper. I managed to give my address before the pain overwhelmed me again. The paramedics arrived quickly. They lifted me onto a stretcher, stabilizing my leg. As they loaded me into the ambulance, the truth settled in. I needed surgery. I would be bedridden for weeks, maybe months. I would be vulnerable. Amidst the fog of pain and fear, one thought offered me solace. When Sarah came, she'd bring the grandchildren. She'd sit by my bed, hold my hand, make me laugh. Derek would come too. Throughout the ambulance ride, this thought enveloped me. They took me to a small, sterile, and silent hospital room. I watched the door, hoping it would open at any moment, expecting to see Sarah's anxious face. But hours passed and the door remained closed. Nurses came and adjusted the monitors. The sky outside turned to night. Still no one came. I drifted into sleep, the morphine dulling the sharpest edges of the pain. But the ache that gnawed at my heart by morning showed that my absolute belief in my family always being there when needed was broken. And somewhere deep down, I began to realize something. They had left me alone, but I would not be helpless anymore. The hospital room seemed even colder the next morning. The sterile white walls reflected the gray light of dawn. I lay still, feeling the weight of the blanket on my legs. My broken hip ached. Nurses performed their duties. The emptiness inside me grew heavier with each opening of the door. In the middle of the morning, I noticed another stranger holding a clipboard. No visitors, no flowers, no calls. I looked at the empty chair beside my bed. It stood there like a monument to my solitude. Sounds from across the hallway served as a reminder of what should be and what wasn't. Laughter. There was a large family gathered in another patient's room. The sounds were like a knife plunging deep into me. I turned my face away from the door. Memories suddenly surfaced. Sarah, at 6 years old, screaming with delight as she climbed into bed with me on Christmas morning. Sarah, at 21, going to her graduation party in her cap and gown. Where was she now? I tried to be reasonable. Maybe she was busy, maybe the kids had soccer practice. But reason couldn't suppress the truth. If they wanted to, they would come. If I mattered, they'd be here. This truth settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating in cold. The nurse came in with my lunch tray. I didn't touch the food. I looked out the window, watching a crow walk along the black sill outside. Then, with a flap of its wings, it flew away. The afternoon was an absolute silence. I tried calling Sarah. It went to voicemail. I left a message, saying I was doing well and wanted to see her if she had time. Hours passed with no reply. Later, a nurse brought a tablet and offered to help me video chat with my family. I thanked her, but said no. I couldn't bear to stare at a blank screen. By evening, the laughter in the hallway died down. The hospital corridors emptied, and the world outside plunged into darkness. I lay there, listening to the hum of the machines. Loneliness was now a living thing. Curled in the corners of the room, pressing down on me. I had given them everything, and when the moment came that I needed them, they were gone. Perhaps they thought I'd always be there, but now I knew better. I knew how quickly time slipped away. Lying in the dark, I made a decision, not out of anger, but from a cold, clear understanding. I wouldn't wait for them anymore. I would rebuild my life, and it would be on my terms. This empty room had taught me something tonight. The next morning, I woke to a thin strip of light seeping through the hospital blinds. The pain in my hip was manageable, but the ache within me had sharpened overnight. The silence of the room pressed down on me, and for the first time, I didn't push it away. I let it in. And in that silence, I realized they hadn't forgotten me. They had chosen to stay away. Deliberately and cruelly, they had chosen their own comfort over my pain. For years, I had stitched their lives together with invisible threads. Not one had been enough to purchase a visit when I was broken and alone. Not one had been sufficient to merit a single bedside vigil. The weight of that truth settled heavily on my chest. But beneath it was clarity. That love meant giving without keeping score. Sacrificing without expecting repayment. I had built my worth on my loyalty, on always being available. And I had taught them, in every silent accommodation, that I would always be there. What did they offer in return? Love without respect wasn't love at all. It was servitude. I thought of Harold's quiet dignity. He had seen me. He had valued me. Now I realized how rare that gift was. I looked at the leather-bound journal that lay unopened on the bedside table. It was a gift from Harold. I opened it to a fresh page. With the pen a nurse had left behind, I began to write. I wrote what I wanted. I wrote what I would no longer tolerate. I wrote what I would build for myself. When I finished, I put down the pen, closed my journal. A strange lightness settled over me. It wasn't happiness yet, but it was the beginning of something better. Happiness was liberation. I knew what I had to do next. From a simple understanding that my life belonged to me. That evening, when the night nurse came, I asked her if she could bring me the hospital's notarized document. Tonight, I would change my will. I would redraw the lines of my inheritance. Because I deserved to leave behind more than silence and disappointment. The hospital corridors grew quieter as evening settled. A little after 9 o'clock, Elaine, the night nurse, entered my room with a clipboard in hand and a small smile on her face. She whispered that the notary, Mr. Harold Bennett, had arrived. He asked simple questions about my wishes. I clearly articulated how I wanted to distribute the things I had built over my lifetime. I left nothing to chance. My modest savings, all the personal belongings in my home, would go to causes and people who had proven their loyalty and kindness through their actions. I designated the local children's library as the primary beneficiary. I set up a scholarship fund for my nursing students at the community college where I once taught. I chose Carol Simmons, my longtime friend, as the recipient of my car and a small gift. There were no bequests for Sarah or Derek. They had made their choices, and now I was making mine. Harold printed the pages from his printer and placed them before me. I read each line carefully. I signed each page. Margaret Campbell. Each signature was an act of reclamation. When the final document was signed and sealed, Harold gathered his materials. He handed me a copy of the documents. He paused, looking at me. "You've made clear choices tonight," he said. I nodded slowly. He bowed his head and walked out into the corridor. Elaine arrived shortly after. She squeezed my hand lightly, but it wasn't the same loneliness. This was a different kind of solitude, a powerful and deliberate loneliness born, not of abandonment, but of choice. I leaned back against the pillows, the signed documents resting on the nightstand. City lights sparkled outside the window. I didn't cry. There was nothing left to mourn, only something new to build. Tomorrow, the hospital would discharge me. Tomorrow, my life would begin anew, and it would be entirely my own, without regret. I woke up with a strange lightness in the twilight. The morning after the papers were signed, the hospital room was still the same, cold, but something inside me had shifted. The room was no longer a place of abandonment. It was a place of transformation. I carefully straightened up, feeling a stiffness in my hip. I looked at the nightstand. Copies of my new will were neatly stacked. The nurse announced that I would be discharged a little after 7. I asked for access to the hospital's small business center. Elaine wheeled me there. I began to compose an email to my lawyer in Salem, Teresa Barnes. I briefly explained the situation and attached scanned copies of the new will. I told her to initiate the update immediately. She was to check the county records regarding my home and contact the institutions where my investments were held. I requested no early disclosure to the new beneficiaries. Everything had to be airtight. I finished and exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My life's modest savings, my small but meaningful belongings, the home Harold and I shared, would now go to places that would carry a piece of me. I thought of Sarah and Derek. I thought about the bewildered expressions they would wear when they learned the truth. But I realized that their dismay and disappointments were no longer my burden. Their anger was no longer my concern. I had lived long enough playing the role of peacemaker, problem solver, and silent giver. Now, I was something else entirely, a taker back. The discharge planner was waiting for me with forms to sign and brochures about home health services. She arranged for a medical transport service to take me home. I would need a walker for a while, maybe some help at home too. But the thought didn't frighten me as it would have a week ago. I wasn't alone. That evening as the sun set, I opened my journal again. I turned to a fresh page and wrote a single sentence. My life belongs to me. Below it, I started a new list. Taking walks in the garden, baking bread, finishing the novel I'd abandoned, visiting the coast, volunteering at the animal shelter, hosting a tea party for friends. Each entry was a reminder that my days could still be full. When the night nurse came to check my blood pressure, she looked at the notebook in my lap and smiled. "Making plans?" she asked. I smiled back. That night, I slept soundly, without dreams. Tomorrow, I would leave this place, moving steadily and surely in my own orbit. The day after tomorrow, I would go home. But not to the life I had known before, but to a new one. I had chosen one. I would live it fully, fiercely, and unapologetically. The day I returned home, the sky was full of low gray clouds. When we arrived at my house, I sat for a moment and looked at the front door, with a strange mix of apprehension and relief. This was my sanctuary. The driver helped me inside. I gripped the handles of my new walker and allowed the silence of the house to envelop me. Slowly, I made my way through the living room and settled into Harold's old armchair. I could see the rose bushes were now wild and untamed. My throat tightened, but not enough to succumb to sentimentality. I hadn't been home an hour when the first call came. The phone pierced the quiet. Sarah's voice was sweet and strained, apologizing for not visiting. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence hang in the space between the words. Finally, I thanked her for calling and told her I was fine. She asked if I had received the flowers she had sent. I told her no flowers had arrived. She mumbled something about a delay and promised to visit soon. Derek's voice could be heard in the background. The conversation ended with a hurried goodbye. I put the phone back. This was not the apology I needed. Later that evening, the phone rang again. This time it was Derek. The tone was different, no sweetness, just a brief formality. He asked how I was doing, whether I needed help with managing the house. I kept my answers short. When he brought up long-term plans, I said I was being kind and detached. Everything was in my hands. There was a pause, heavy with a burden. Then he asked if we could sit down and review, emphasizing how important family was. I told him we could talk soon. We ended the call shortly thereafter.
In the following days, the calls, disguised as concern, were intermittent and awkward. Sarah sent text messages with photos of the grandchildren. Derek conveyed a warmth that never quite reached me. Not once did either of them honestly acknowledge where things had gone wrong. Every ring of the phone was a small confirmation of the choice I had made. Every message was a reminder of the difference between true connection and obligation presented under the guise of convenience. Sometimes I didn't rush to return their calls. Sometimes I didn't return them at all. Instead, I spent my days rebuilding my life on my own terms. I hired the neighbor's child to help with yard work. I arranged for a physical therapist to come twice a week. I ordered groceries online. And at night, when the calls inevitably dwindled and the world fell silent again, I sat by the window with a book or a puzzle and felt something blossom in the quiet, the freedom of self. In the end, they hadn't noticed me in my absence. And now it was too late. I was no longer waiting for them to come back. I had already chosen myself. The day of the meeting arrived slowly. The air was thick with oppressive heat. I spent the morning quietly, preparing a pitcher of lemonade and a plate of cookies. My lawyer, Teresa Barnes, arrived first. She had sharp, intelligent eyes. She shook my hand and placed her briefcase on the coffee table. She sat down and arranged the papers she had brought. Soon after, Sarah and Derek gathered. The tension between them was palpable. They barely looked at me, their eyes constantly flitting to Teresa, to the stack of documents on the table. We made a few minutes of awkward small talk. Finally, when the false pleasantries could stretch no further, Teresa cleared her throat and opened the file, her voice beginning to read. Bewilderment dawned on Sarah's and Derek's faces as the contents of the new will were revealed. The house, upon my death, would be sold, and the proceeds donated equally to the local children's library and the nursing scholarship fund. My personal savings were divided among the same individuals, including a small sum allocated to Carol Simmons for her unwavering friendship during the darkest times of my life. My car, my jewelry, even the sentimental items in my home, were carefully assigned to the people and organizations who had touched my life with kindness and sincerity. When Teresa read the part about the library, Sarah gasped audibly. Derek's face flushed with anger. Teresa did not pause, continuing on, quiet and relentless. When she finished, she closed the folder. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the wall clock. Sarah's voice was the first heard, trembling, as she asked if there had been a mistake. I looked back at her and said nothing. Derek erupted with less measured fury. He accused Teresa of manipulating me, of betraying me. I opened my mouth again, saying nothing. I didn't owe them an explanation. at every turn.
Now they looked at me as if seeing a stranger. I was Margaret Campbell, 68 years old, a widowed nurse whose friend had survived, and now the architect of my own legacy. Sarah finally stood, tears shining in her eyes, but anger hardened her. She said she needed time to digest everything. Derek mumbled something under his breath. They left without another word, the door closing with a definitive click behind them. It felt less like an end and more like a beginning. Teresa gathered her things. She touched my shoulder. After she left, I sat alone in the living room for a long time. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt vindicated. What I felt was peace, the kind that comes from knowing you've spoken the truth not with words, but with actions. And outside the window, the roses swayed, wild and beautiful, untamed and flourishing, as if deciding that was enough. The morning after the will reading dawned cool and bright. I woke earlier than usual. The house was filled with an unfamiliar but welcome quiet. I had no appointments. I made myself a dark and strong coffee, just the way Harold always liked it. I sipped it slowly, wrapped up on the back porch. I watched the light creep into the garden. The rose bushes danced in the breeze. There was a strange sweetness in the solitude. I no longer had to justify my presence, my love, to people who saw it as an obligation rather than a gift. I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow notebook in the mid-morning and made a list of only the things I wanted to do. I volunteered at the library again. I went on a weekend trip to Cannon Beach. I adopted a quiet old dog and even learned to paint. On Sunday, I attended the farmer's market, and I hosted a book club for the ladies in the neighborhood. Over the last few months, a new kind of family had emerged, and the list grew longer. Early in the afternoon, I called Carol Simmons and invited her to lunch. Within an hour, she arrived with a bouquet of wildflowers in her hand. We ate on the porch, laughing over stories from our nursing days, marveling at how strange and wonderful life could be when you felt good about yourself. Carol asked me if I had plans for the weekend. I told her I was thinking of driving to the coast. She grinned and said if I didn't mind her tagging along, she'd come with me. As the sun sank lower in the sky, I walked slowly through the house, touching the framed photographs on the mantelpiece. These were the remnants of a life well lived. In the days that followed, Sarah and Derek sent a few more messages, tentative, strained, and clumsy attempts to find footing on a bridge that no longer stood, buried under their neglect. I replied, gently, but without urgency, when I chose to. I knew them well, silently and intimately, but I no longer bent myself into shapes that would assuage their painful discomfort. I was not cruel, just free. Free to love without being taken for granted. Free to give without emptying myself. Free to live my remaining years with fierce compassion. A few weeks later, one evening, Carol and I stood at the edge of Cannon Beach, the wet sand cool beneath our feet. The ocean breeze carried away the last tattered remnants of my old life through our hair. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, inhaling the salty air and letting the steady roar of the waves drown out every other sound within me. When I opened my eyes again, the world looked sharper, brighter. This wasn't the life I had planned, nor the life others had assumed for me. It was the life I had chosen, a bold step. I had not merely survived the loneliness, the betrayal, the abandonment. I had transcended it, transformed into something stronger, something wiser, something impossibly beautiful and whole. And standing there, with the ocean singing, an endless song before me, I promised myself I would never again ask, do I have permission to be happy? I would live on my own terms, to the very end, and fiercely. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the like button.